327 pages of evidence, 62 illegal filings, 187 days of an expired law license, and 12 million Americans holding their breath. When Habba mocked Jasmine Crockett as too young, she thought it was over. But in just 29 seconds, Crockett unleashed a bombshell that shattered her career on live television. The chamber erupted, the nation gasped, and one woman stood taller than ever. The question is, when justice finally strikes, will America rise or collapse under the weight of its own lies? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber did not feel like a hearing room that morning, it felt like a battlefield. The air was heavy, humming with the tension, the country ripping itself apart. America was fractured, split open by post-election scars that refused to heal. Headlines screamed of fraud, conspiracies, secret deals, and betrayals. Trust in Congress had collapsed, leaving 63% of Americans convinced the system no longer served them. This was not politics anymore. This was survival. Every eye was fixed on the mahogany desk at the center, where two women so different, so symbolic were about to collide. Habba entered first, striding into the Capitol like a queen entering her court. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for her smirk. She had been branded Trump's iron lawyer, celebrated on Fox as fearless, condemned on MSNBC as ruthless. To her followers, she was invincible. To date, she carried that same swagger, the kind that dare anyone to challenge her. And then came her opponent. Jasmine Crockett walked in quietly. No theatrics, no performance. But her silence was louder than applause, and her eyes burned with a focus so sharp it sliced through the nose. Those who knew her mission whispered, she wasn't here to spar for sport, she was here for war. The media had mocked her endlessly. Too young, too inexperienced, too soft. On Twitter, memes called her the rookie mistake. Habba herself had laughed off the idea of facing Crockett, saying privately that it would be like boxing with a child. But Crockett wasn't carrying only her own name. She carried the voices of communities silenced for generations, families broken by injustice, and voters who had been told their struggles didn't matter. Every word she would speak today belonged to them. For her, this wasn't theater, this was life and death. Inside the chamber, anticipation cold like a spring. Senators leaned forward in their chairs, reporters tapped their pens against notepads. Even the marble walls seemed to hold their breath. It had the feel of a gladiator pit, the sense that blood, if not literal, then reputational, would be spilled before the day was done. Habba glanced at Crockett with disdain, her smirk daring the younger woman to try. Crockett did not flinch. She sat, still as stone, eyes locked on Habba, the silence stretching until it cut like a blade. For one sigh, this was supposed to be entertainment. For the other, it was destiny. Habba thought she would humiliate a rookie. Crockett knew she would expose a fraud. Between them, under the blinding lights and the weight of millions watching live, the Capitol itself seemed to tremble. And as the gavel slammed down, every heartbeat in the room asked the same question. When arrogance meets justice, who will speak louder? Habba was never meant to be ordinary. She carved her way into Trump's inner circle not by caution or humility, but by fire. An attorney who understood that in his orbit, arrogance wasn't a flaw, it was currency. She embraced it, weaponized it, and wore it like armor. To his supporters, she was the warrior who never blinked, the glamorous defender who spat in the face of critics. To his enemies, she was reckless, volatile, a mouthpiece built to slash and burn. But for Habba, image was everything. And in Washington, she had mastered the art of making a spectacle feel like power. From the moment she entered the chamber, it was clear she intended to dominate. Her heels struck the marble like gunfire, her tailored suit catching the camera lights as though the room itself bent to her presence. She knew the headlines were already being written. Habba crushed congressional newcomer. Reporters, primed by weeks of spin, had their leads drafted before the hearing even began. Fox News was poised to declare victory. Conservative blogs had already labeled Jasmine Crockett childish, untested, irrelevant. Habba had set the narrative long before she opened her mouth. In her mind, this wasn't a fair fight, it was a coronation. Her strategy was simple and cruel. Don't debate. Belittle. Don't acknowledge Crockett as an equal. Portray her as a child fumbling with adult toes. Every glance, every smirk was calibrated to strip away dignity before a word could be spoken. She whispered to aides that Crockett would fold in under 10 minutes, boasting that her opponent's composure would crack once the insults started to rain. Habba thrived on humiliation. She believed victory wasn't won with facts, but with dominance, the kind that leaves the other side too broken to fight back. At her flank sat Congressman Jim Jordan, the bulldog of the House, ready to bark and snarl on command. He wasn't just backup, he was her political shield, the man who could drown out any inconvenient fact with a roar of outrage. Together, they looked untouchable, Habba with her smirk and Jordan with his fists pounding the table. The script was set, the performance rehearsed. All that remained was Crockett's collapse. Yet there was something Habba didn't see or refused to see. While she basked in the cameras and whispered promises of humiliation, Crockett's silence in those opening moments wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Habba's confidence swelled so high that she mistook her own reflection for reality. The crowd might have cheered her swagger, the media might have sharpened their pens in her favor, but storms don't announce themselves before they strike. And so, as Habba leaned back in her chair, smiling like a queen about to preside over execution, the question lingered like smoke in the chamber. What happens when confidence blinds you to the storm already forming in the silence across the table? The night before the hearing, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her modest DC apartment, the city lights flickering against the window like restless stars. Her notes were spread across the table, but her eyes weren't on the papers, they were on the faces etched in her memory. Mothers from her district who had begged for justice after their sons were gunned down without cause. Families who worked 3 jobs and still went hungry. Neighbors who lived in poverty while billionaires grew fatter off corruption. She carried them all inside her chest, and the weight was suffocating, yet it fueled her with a fire that refused to die. Tomorrow wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning. The room was quiet until her phone buzzed. On the screen, a video call from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AOC's face appeared, fierce but warm, a reminder that Crockett wasn't walking into the arena alone. "They'll come at you hard, Jasmine," she said, her voice both warning and encouragement. "They'll try to humiliate you, break you, make you doubt yourself. But remember, every second you hold that ground, you're holding it for millions who have no microphone. Don't give them silence, give them truth." Crockett listened, her throat tightening. This wasn't just political sisterhood. It was a passing of the torch, one fighter whispering to another, "Stand tall, the people need you." That night, sleep wouldn't come. When she closed her eyes, she saw her district in flashes, almost like a fever dream. The grocery store owner who lost everything when corporate chains devoured local business. The young black student who asked her once, "Will anyone ever fight for us?" The grandmother who handed her a Bible during the campaign and said, "Don't let them steal our voice." Every story pressed against her heart like blades, cutting deep but reminding her why she had chosen this brutal path. The images weren't a burden, they were a vow. She would walk into that chamber tomorrow as their weapon, their voice, their hope. And so, while Ilena Habba rehearsed insults and reporters polished pre-written headlines, Jasmine Crockett was arming herself with something more dangerous than arrogance, conviction. She knew the odds, she knew the smirks, the laughter, the mockery waiting for her. But she also knew that giants can fall when someone small dares to strike with truth. The silence she held in the chamber wasn't weakness, it was patience, the kind of patience that precedes thunder. The night ended not with rest but with resolve. Crockett stood at her window, watching the sleepless city pulse with anticipation. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "For them, I will not break." And as dawn crept over Washington, one thought rang louder than fear, louder than doubt. Can one voice carry the weight of millions, or will the silence of a nation crush it? The gavel struck once, and the chamber stilled into anticipation. Ilena Habba rose with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to impact. She adjusted her jacket, leaned into the microphone, and with millions watching live, delivered her opening strike. It's laughable, truly laughable, that such weighty matters would be handed to someone like Representative Crockett, too young, too inexperienced, too naive to understand the gravity of this room. Her words dripped with venom, every syllable crafted not to debate but to humiliate. The Republican side erupted in laughter, their mocking applause echoing through the chamber like jeers in a coliseum. Jim Jordan leaned forward, pounding his fist against the desk, his voice booming in agreement. "She doesn't belong here, she's in over her head." His outburst fed the frenzy. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett, her face lit by the glare of ridicule, framed for the nation as the sacrificial lamb about to be devoured. The performance was cruel, deliberate, and orchestrated. Habba smirked, eyes darting to the press gallery as if she were directing the scene for them, not the committee. Reporters scribbled furiously, ready to write the headline she had scripted for them. Trump's iron lawyer crushes rookie lawmaker. The cruelty wasn't improvised, it was theater. Stage humiliation designed to strip Crockett's dignity before she could utter a single word. Habba raised her hand theatrically, as though brushing Crockett aside, and Jordan chimed in again, louder, leaning into the cruelty with relish. This is a waste of time. Put her back in the classroom where she belongs. The Republican benches roared with laughter, the sound echoing off the chamber's vaulted ceiling until it felt suffocating. For a moment, the humiliation seemed complete. Habba leaned back, crossing her arms with the pose of a queen convinced her crown was secure. Crockett sat motionless, the cameras catching every detail of her silence, the clenched jaw, the eyes that did not flinch, the composure that did not crack. Viewers at home saw two realities at once, one of triumph, staged by Habba, and one of patience, burning inside Crockett like a fuse waiting to ignite. Every insult added fuel, every laugh tightened the coal of tension in the room. Habba mistook Crockett's silence for defeat. But the audience watching, the millions glued to screens, could sense something else brewing, something Habba, in her arrogance, was too blind to see. The chamber had turned into a circus, the cruelty of power on display, the underdog mocked for daring to stand in the ring. Yet amid the laughter, amid the jeers, there was a quiet undertow pulling everyone closer to the edge of their seats. They could feel it. The silence wasn't surrender, it was a storm gathering in plain sight. And as Habba smirked and Jordan sneered, the unspoken question tightened its grip on the room like a noose. How much humiliation can one leader endure before striking back with a blow that changes everything? The laughter still echoed when Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, unmoved, her hands folded neatly on the desk before her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush to defend herself, didn't even frown. She simply sat there silent. For the first time all morning, the chamber's nose faltered. The cameras, hungry for drama, zoomed in tight on her face. Her jaw was firm, her breathing steady, her eyes locked forward with a stillness that was almost unnatural. Millions of viewers at home saw it in the same instant. This wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence before something dangerous. Reporters in the gallery exchanged nervous glances, their pens frozen mid-sentence. Even Jordan's smirk slipped for a beat as he realized the target of his mockery was not rattled, not even blinking. Crockett's silence was calculated, surgical, the kind of silence that unsettled enemies more than any shouted retort. Habba shifted in her chair, waiting for the protest that never came, her mocking grin faltering as the seconds stretched. 20, 25, 30 seconds. The chamber, once a circus of jeers, had grown uncomfortably quiet. The weight of that silence pressed on every chest like a storm cloud lowering by the second. The broadcast directors instinctively cut between Crockett's face and Habba's, crafting a split-screen duel. On one side, Habba restless, her eyes darting as though searching for new words to maintain her dominance. On the other, Crockett still, composed, her stare sharper than any weapon. Viewers on Twitter lit up instantly. She's plotting something. Why isn't she speaking? This silence is scarier than shouting. The clip was already being replayed online in real time, the nation transfixed not by insults, but by restraint. Every second she refused to break, the power in the room shifted. What began as stage humiliation was now backfiring, turning into suspense so thick that allies and enemies alike were leaning forward in their chairs. One Democrat whispered to another, "She's baiting them." Even AOC, seated further back, allowed a faint smile as though she recognized the tactic. Habba, however, saw only defiance where she had expected collapse. That defiance, cloaked in silence, rattled her more than she could admit. She tapped her pen against the desk, her confidence stripping away drop by drop. The silence became its own weapon, a mirror forcing Habba and Jordan to see their arrogance reflected back at them, warped into fragility. Crockett didn't need to defend herself, she was letting them unravel on their own, while the nation watched with bated breath. It was the kind of moment television producers dream of, the kind of pause that tightens a story like a bowstring just before release. And when Crockett finally chose to speak, it was clear to everyone in the chamber that the silence had already won. Because in that stillness, in that unbearable calm, one truth rang louder than every insult hurled her way. What is more dangerous than words? Silence. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable, and then Jasmine Crockett moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached down to her briefcase and lifted a thick binder wrapped in a crimson cover. The sound of it hitting the desk cracked through the chamber like thunder. 327 pages slammed into the polished wood with a weight that silenced even the whispers. Reporters jolted upright, pens scratching, cameras whirring, knowing instinctively this was no ordinary file. Crockett placed her hand flat on the stack, her gaze never leaving Habba's face. Then she spoke, not in anger, not in haste, but with the precision of a blade. This is the record of every case you filed in the last 6 months. And every single one of them carries the same fatal flaw because your license to practice law expired 187 days ago. The chamber froze, time itself seemed to stop. Habba's smirk disintegrated, her eyes whitening as though the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Jim Jordan sputtered, halfway rising from his chair, but no sound came out. Across the aisle, Democrats leaned forward like spectators watching a guillotine drop. The blow wasn't loud, it was quiet, contained in one sentence, but it detonated like a bomb in the nation's capital. Crockett let the words hang, refusing to rush, letting the silence sharpen the blade she had just driven into her opponent's armor. Then, with surgical calm, she added, "You called me inexperienced. But what's more inexperienced than practicing law without the right to do so?" Gasps erupted. A reporter in the gallery muttered, "Oh my God," loud enough for the microphone to catch it. A producer at CNN whispered into his mic, "Cut to Crockett, cut to her now." And on millions of screens across the country, her calm face filled living rooms, kitchens, and bars, a picture of composure while her rival crumbled. On Twitter, the clip was already trending within seconds. Hashtags flooded in. Hashtag HABBA exposed. Hashtag license expired. Hashtag Crockett strikes. The numbers exploded: 10,000 tweets, 50,000, 100,000 in under 3 minutes. Commentators scrambled to rewrite the narrative. What had begun as Habba's victory lap was mutating into a career-ending ambush, unfolding in real time. Habba tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. Jordan barked about procedural nonsense, pounding his fist, but the performance rang hollow against the weight of the document lying heavy on the desk. Crockett didn't need to shout, she had detonated a truth so devastating it silenced even the loudest voices in the room. The Capitol had seen countless hearings, countless scandals, but nothing like this. One lie, one revelation, one woman transforming humiliation into history. And as the chamber sat paralyzed in shock, the question rippled through every screen, every whisper, every headline about to be written. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? The chamber sat frozen for a breathless moment after Crockett's bombshell, and then chaos detonated. Habba shot up from her chair, her voice sharp and trembling, straining to claw back control. "This is a clerical error, nothing more than a technical oversight," she shouted, waving her hands with the desperation of someone watching their fortress crumble. Her polished composure was gone, replaced by frantic energy. Reporters scribbled like mad, the press gallery buzzing, the room spiraling into uproar. Jim Jordan slammed his palm against the desk, his voice thundering over the roar. "This is nonsense. You will not smear one of the finest attorneys in America with paperwork tricks." His words cracked like gunfire, drowning out Democratic voices demanding order. Jordan leaned forward, his face red, veins bulging, pointing a finger at Crockett as though sheer rage could erase the evidence lying on the desk. Habba seized on his nose, nodding frantically, her tone climbing higher, faster. "You all know how bureaucracy works. Licenses renew automatically, systems lag, clerks make mistakes. This means nothing. Nothing." Her voice quivered with the false bravado of someone trying to shout down their own fear. But every denial rang hollow against the crimson binder sitting heavy in front of Crockett. The very pages Habba dismissed as clerical bore signatures, case numbers, filing 62 in total, each one tainted, each one illegal. The evidence didn't blink, didn't stutter, didn't flinch, and neither did Jasmine Crockett. While Habba flailed and Jordan roared, Crockett sat perfectly still, her gaze locked forward like a sniper waiting for the exact second to pull the trigger. Her silence once again magnified the hysteria unraveling across the table. The more they screamed, the smaller they seemed. The more noise they created, the more powerful her calm became. Viewers at home felt it, tweeting furiously, "Why is she so calm? She knows something, she's about to finish them." Even members of Congress shifted uncomfortably, the spectacle to loud, to desperate, to staged. The power dynamic had inverted, and the audience could sense it. Habba and Jordan were no longer predators, they were prey thrashing in the trap. The chair's gavel pounded in vain, unable to silence the shouting. Jordan's woes cracked as he bellowed about witch hunts, Habba's defenses crumbling into half-sentences and excuses. Across from them, Crockett finally tilted her head slightly, one hand resting on the binder, her composure a silent rebuke to the chaos erupting around her. It was as if she was letting them dig their own graves with every word. Every shout, every denial, every desperate plea only deepened the hole. The spectacle had become grotesque, one side screaming to bury the truth, the other side silent, uncheckable, letting the weight of evidence speak louder than fury. And as the shouting reached fever pitch, the thought pressed into every viewer's mind like a blade: can noise truly bury the truth, or does it only make the silence more deafening? The shouting from Habba and Jordan reached a fever pitch when Jasmine Crockett finally moved. Calmly, almost too calmly, she flipped open the crimson binder resting before her. The camera zoomed in, catching the blur of dense legal text, page after page marked with signatures and case numbers. Crockett slid her finger down the first page and spoke with the precision of a surgeon. Case 21 to 443, filed under Alina Habba, 147 days after her license expired. Case 21 to 612, filed 173 days after expiration. Case 21 to 799, filed 186 days after expiration. She turned the pages like a metronome, each number hitting the chamber with the weight of a hammer blow. The room fell silent except for her voice, steady and unflinching. 62 filings in total, each one unlawful. Each one tainted by illegitimacy, each one a fraud against the American legal system. She let the words hang in the air, the echoes bouncing off the marble walls. Senators sat frozen, mouths slightly open, some scribbling notes in disbelief, others sinking back in their chairs as if the floor itself had tilted beneath them. Across the gallery, reporters scrambled, bolting from their seats, sprinting toward the exits to blast the story into the world. News producers whispered frantically into their headsets, cameras cutting tighter on Habba's tailing face. Habba tried to laugh it off, her voice breaking. "This is absurd, clerical misfiled." But the stammer betrayed her. Jordan jumped in, shouting, "Out of order, out of order." Pounding the desk as if volume could erase the numbers Crockett had just read into the congressional record. But the numbers were immovable, factual, devastating. They were not accusations, they were proof, and proof doesn't shout. Proof doesn't break, proof doesn't beg. Crockett closed the binder halfway, resting her hand on its cover, her gaze locked directly on Habba. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. For half a year, you misled courts, misled clients, and poisoned the rule of law with your negligence. 62 times, you stood before a judge without the authority to even call yourself counsel, and yet you call me inexperienced. The words were quieter than the chaos that had preceded them, but far deadlier. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a death sentence spoken aloud. On television screens across the nation, anchors broke into their broadcasts. "We are getting stunning news out of Capitol Hill. Representative Jasmine Crockett has just presented evidence showing that Alina Habba filed 62 cases without a valid license." Within minutes, Twitter and TikTok were flooded with clips, hashtags exploding, hashtag 62 fraud cases, hashtag HABBA exposed, hashtag Crockett strikes. Millions of viewers replayed the footage, watching in disbelief as a woman dismissed as too young dismantled a titan of Trump's legal machine with nothing but paper and truth. The chamber had shifted again, not with nose, but with the raw, uncheckable gravity of fact. Crockett had turned the binder into a weapon, each page a bullet, each case number another nail in a coffin being built in real time. And as the evidence settled like ash in the stunned silence, one question pressed itself against the minds of every senator, every viewer, every ally and enemy alike: what if every case you built was a fraud? The crimson binder had barely closed when the aftershocks erupted across America. Within minutes, CNN cut into its programming with a flashing red banner. Breaking: Habba legally filed 60 cases under expired license. Anchors spoke with voices tight with disbelief, replaying the moment Crockett read the numbers aloud, her calm composure against Habba's unraveling panic. On MSNBC, the coverage was merciless. Legal analysts called it not just a scandal, but a career-ending catastrophe, with one commentator declaring flatly, "No attorney comes back from this." 62 fraudulent filings, that's not negligence, that's malpractice on a national scale. Meanwhile, Fox News scrambled to contain the fire, its chyron spinning another reality. Witch hunt against Trump's top lawyer, clerical mistake exploded. Their hosts thundered about persecution, about weaponized bureaucracy, about Democrats staging another show trial. But the split-screen chaos only made the spectacle bigger, louder, impossible to ignore. On social media, the explosion was instant and uncontrollable. Twitter now ignited with hashtags rising like wildfire. Hashtag HABDA humiliated. Hashtag 6-2 fraud cases. Hashtag Crockett strikes. In less than an hour, 2.7 million tweets flooded the platform, clips of Crockett slamming the binder onto the desk going viral in real time. TikTok stitched the footage with dramatic music, edits flashing 187 days expired across the screen, drawing tens of millions of views by evening. Instagram feeds filled with memes of Habba's stunned expression, side by side with Crockett's unflinching stare, captions screaming, "The moment power shifted." On Reddit, legal forums lit up with furious debates, lawyers dissecting the implications, judges who might reopen cases, clients left exposed, the entire credibility of Habba's career shredded live on air. Reporters outside the Capitol scrambled like war correspondents, speaking breathlessly into cameras. One shouted over the din of protesters, "I have never seen a career implode in real time like this. This is beyond politics. This is legal history unfolding on the floor of Congress." Protesters had already gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. 62 lies. 62 lies, the sound carried into the night, filmed and broadcast across every major network. Inside homes, bars, and offices across the country, viewers replayed the moment over and over again. Parents called their children to the television, saying, "Watch this is history." Young activists texted each other in disbelief. She did it. Crockett actually did it. For every insult hurled at her as too young, too inexperienced, this moment rewrote the narrative. The underdog had not just survived, she had struck with precision, exposing her opponent with a single sentence and a mountain of proof. But as the storm raged inside the Capitol, the silence around Habba was deafening. Her allies looked away. Her political shield Jim Jordan's voice cracked as even he struggled to scream over the tide of fact. No spin, no nose, no volume could erase the image seared into the nation's mind. And across screens, across headlines, across history itself, one question began to echo with a force louder than the chaos. When truth trends, can lies survive? The evidence still hung in the air like smoke from an explosion when Alina Habba's expression twisted into something darker. Her defenses had shattered, her license exposed, her credibility bleeding out before the cameras, and so she lunged for the only weapon left: venom. Her voice sharpened into a sneer as she spat across the chamber. "Of course you would say this, Representative Crockett. You've built your whole career playing the race card. You're not here because of merit, you're here because you fit the quota." Gasps rippled through the room, a sickening shock that snapped spines upright. But Habba wasn't done. She leaned closer to the mic, the fire in her eyes manic. "Too young, too inexperienced. And let's be honest, you're nothing more than a puppet dressed up as progress." The chamber erupted into chaos. Democrats shouted back, their voices colliding in outrage. Republicans smirked, some even clapping, while others shifted uncomfortably at the ugliness unraveling in front of them. Jim Jordan roared in support, pounding the table as though the louder the echo, the deeper the wound. The insults multiply, sharper, uglier, dripping with racism and misogyny. Habba's carefully cultivated image of a polished attorney had cracked into a raw display of desperation. The performance wasn't legal argument anymore, it was a public meltdown broadcast to millions. Yet through the storm, Jasmine Crockett remained still. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes locked on Habba with a look not of anger, but of pity. She didn't flinch, she didn't lash back. She let the poison spill and fill the chamber until it began to choke its own speaker. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett's face, the con after the storm, while Habba flailed, her words curdling into uglier and uglier bile. Viewers at home felt the shift immediately. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was self-destruction caught live on camera. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, their headlines writing themselves. Habba crosses the line. Racial attacks in hearing stun nation. One analyst whispered into his earpiece, she just ended her career on live television. On Twitter, hashtags shifted from hashtag HABBA humiliated to hashtag HABBA meltdown, climbing with brutal speed. Clips of her sneer, her words dripping with contempt, were caught, shared, remixed into viral bursts that spread faster than fire. Memes painted her as Trump's poison lawyer, while young activists blasted her as the face of everything wrong with America's power structure. Still, Crockett said nothing. Her silence was louder than outrage, her restraint deadlier than fury. She allowed Habba to unravel, every second magnifying the ugliness spilling from her mouth. And when Habba finally stopped for breath, sweat beading on her forehead, the silence that followed was crushing. It wasn't victory, it was exposure. Habba had stripped herself bare, revealing not strength but fear. Not authority, but desperation. The hearing no longer felt like politics, it felt like an autopsy, the dissection of a reputation collapsing under the weight of its own venom. And as the nation watched in horror and fascination, one question thundered louder than the insults, echoing across the airwaves and into history. How far will someone fall to protect their pride? The chamber still vibrated with the venom of Habba's personal attacks when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward, her hand steady on the crimson binder. The camera zoomed in, the air tense with anticipation. Her voice, low but cutting, sliced through the nose like a scalpel. If you want to talk about merit, let's talk about truth. And if you want to talk about truth, let's start with these signatures. She flipped open a folder tucked inside the binder and held up the first page for the room to see. The silence was razor sharp. Exhibit A, Trump v. Fulton County, filed under your name, Ms. Habba, 143 days after your license expired. And here your signature, right beneath the oath of validity. Gasps rippled across the chamber. She didn't pause. Exhibit B, Trump v. Dominion, filed 161 days after expiration. Again, your signature, swearing full compliance under penalty of law. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The calm precision made the evidence lethal. Every word was another incision, exposing fraud vein by vein. The room grew heavier with each revelation. Exhibit C, Trump v. United States Postal Service, filed 179 days after expiration. Your signature again, same hand, same fraud. Habba's face drained of color, her lips parting soundlessly as if air had abandoned her. Jordan tried to interject, shouting political theater, but the gavel silenced him, and all eyes returned to Crockett. She raised the final page, her tone almost cold. Exhibit D, Trump v. Pennsylvania, filed 186 days after expiration. Signature verify, forge authority, for lawsuits, for fraudulent signatures, for crimes against this democracy. The chamber gasped, louder this time, no longer whispers, at the sound of an entire body politic stunned into disbelief. Reporters leapt from their seats, shoving past one another toward the exits. Phones already held to ears, their voices frantic. She's got signatures, fraudulent signatures. This is bigger than we thought. CNN cut its chyron. Crockett, Habba filed fraudulent signatures in Trump cases. MSNBC's anchors called it the smoking gun. Even Fox News faltered. Its hosts caught between spin and the undeniable image of Crockett holding the document steady under the camera's unforgiving eye. Habba's voice cracked when she tried to respond. That's not fraud. But the sentence collapsed under the weight of Crockett's stillness. Crockett didn't yell, she didn't mock, she simply read the truth aloud, one document at a time, until the lies could no longer breathe. Her precision was relentless, surgical, stripping away Habba's defenses layer by layer until nothing remained but naked fraud laid bare before the nation. The chamber had turned into a courtroom, and Crockett had become its executioner. No theatrics, no insults, no rage, just truth delivered like a blade to the jugular. And as her final words echoed across the marble walls, a single question burned through every screen, every tweet, every stunned whisper. What happens when lies are read out loud? Outside the Capitol, the eruption was instantaneous. Crowds that had gathered to watch the hearing on giant screens broke into chants that shook the stone steps. "Justice for America! Justice for America!" Protesters waved handmade signs. 6 to lies equals nitrogen monoxide justice and Crockett equals courage, while television crews fought to capture the chaos of a city suddenly vibrating with righteous fury. Police erected barricades, not to disperse the crowd, but to contain its swelling size as thousands surged forward, their voices merging into a roar that could be heard blocks away. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across banners and faces lit with defiance. For years, people had felt ignored, drowned out by power and privilege, but today the air felt different. They were no longer invisible. Inside newsrooms, the numbers painted the same story. A flash poll released just hours after Crockett's bombshell showed 67% of Americans siding with her, calling her revelations credible and damning. Even independents, long skeptical of partisan brawls, swung heavily in her favor. Analysts on MSNBC called it a seismic shift, while a stunned CNN anchor said flatly, "This is not just about Habba anymore, this is about trust in the system itself." Fox News clung desperately to the word witch hunt, but the spin rang hollow against the roar of voices outside, and the flood of evidence replaying on loop across every network. In minority communities across the country, Crockett's stand became something more than a political moment, it became a symbol. In Dallas, church bells rang as congregations gathered spontaneously, cheering her name. In Detroit, mothers lit candles and held up pictures of children lost to injustice, saying, "She stood for us." In the Bronx, young activists marched through the streets, blasting the clip of Crockett dropping the binder through portable speakers, each replay greeted with cheers. Social media captured it all, videos of crowds weeping, strangers embracing, chants echoing late into the night, one voice for millions. For decades, communities had felt crushed under the weight of a system stacked against them. The watching Crockett stand calm in the face of ridicule, and then methodically tear down one of the most powerful attorneys in the country, struck like lightning. It was proof that strength didn't always come from volume, but from truth carried with conviction. She had not shouted, she had not raged, she had simply exposed the lie, and in doing so, reminded a fractured nation that even the most silenced voices could still shake the foundations of power. As the crowds outside grew louder, as the polls surged in her favor, as chants of Crockett, Crockett, echoed through the night, one truth became undeniable. The underdog had become the standard-bearer for millions. And across the screens of a nation still trembling from shock, the question rang louder than the chants, louder than the headlines, louder than the chaos itself. When the voiceless find a champion, can they ever be silenced again? The chamber that once echoed with Habba's swagger was now suffocating in silence, the kind that crushed rather than comforts. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered, tripping over syllables that once rolled out with rehearsed ease. These filings, they were clerical mistakes. The words fractured, collapsing under their own weight. Her hand trembled as she reached for her notes, the paper shaking so violently the microphones picked it up. The once unshakable iron lawyer looked brittle, every gesture exposing cracks in the armor she had so carefully crafted. Jim Jordan lunged forward to save her, his voice booming, his fists hammering the desk as if he could drown out reality with volume alone. "This is outrageous, a political smear. We will not allow Representative Crockett to weaponize paperwork against a patriot." His roar filled the chamber, but it was desperation, not dominance. The louder he grew, the more his words sounded like the last gasps of a sinking ship. Senators on both sides exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes no longer locked on Crockett but on Habba, unraveling in real time. Habba clutched at Jordan's momentum like a lifeline, nodding frantically, forcing her lips into the ghost of a smile, but the facade couldn't hold. The camera zoomed in close enough to catch the sheen of sweat on her forehead, the twitch at the corner of her mouth, the flicker of panic in her eyes. Every attempt to steady herself only exposed how deeply she was shaking. The public watching at home could feel this was no longer a battle of evidence. It was the disintegration of a persona, arrogance collapsing into fear. Reporters in the press gallery stopped scribbling and simply stared, some with their mouths open, others whispering to each other in disbelief. Phones lit up with breaking alerts. Habba crumbles under pressure. MSNBC commentators, speaking live, abandoned their prepared notes, one saying bluntly, This is not the face of confidence. This is collapse. Even Fox, usually her shield, hesitated. Their ink is visibly struggling to spin what millions of viewers could see with their own eyes. A lawyer once painted as indestructible, now unraveling before the nation. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat silent, her eyes locked on Habba with the steadiness of a judge waiting for the final verdict. She didn't need to move, didn't need to speak. The weight of truth had already done the work. Every stutter, every tremor, every desperate glance for rescue was another crack widening in Habba's foundation. Jordan's shouts couldn't plaster over the fissures, the walls were coming down. By the time Habba's voice finally broke completely, her words dissolving into incoherence, the chamber was no longer watching an attorney defend herself, they were watching a reputation collapse brick by brick. And as the gavel pounded for order that no one could restore, a question rose above the rubble of arrogance now crumbling to dust. Can arrogance withstand the weight of truth, or does it always break when the pressure becomes unbearable? The chamber was trembling with chaos when Jasmine Crockett finally rose from her seat. She didn't raise her voice above the shouting, she didn't need to. The weight of silence that followed her movements was enough to command the room. She stepped forward, binder closed, eyes locked on Habba, who sat pale and trembling, a shadow of the arrogance that had strutted in hours earlier. Crockett placed both hands on the desk, her voice clear, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Age does not define wisdom, but corruption always defines downfall. The words cut through the chamber like a blade, clean and merciless. For a heartbeat, no one breath, then the reaction hit like an earthquake. The Democratic side leapt to their feet, applause thundered against the marble walls, cheers broke out from the gallery above. Even some Republicans sat frozen, caught between loyalty and the undeniable sting of truth. Reporters scrambled, their fingers flying across keyboards, their headlines writing themselves. Crockett delivers fatal blow. Television anchors repeated the line in real time, their voices trembling as if they too understood they were narrating a moment that would etch itself into history. Habba slumped in her chair, unable to answer. Jordan's shouts died in his throat, drowned beneath the avalanche of applause rolling through the chamber. The cameras capture everything. Crockett standing tall, her expression steady but fierce, the embodiment of unshaken resolve. It was cinematic, a crescendo that didn't just silence a rival, but symbolized the collapse of a dynasty built on arrogance and deceit. Outside, the chants from protesters, "Justice for America," merged with the thunder inside, echoing into the night sky of Washington. The nation wasn't just watching, they were bearing witness. A single line had transformed the narrative, the underdog crushing the titan in real time. History had pivoted in that instant, proof that dignity and conviction could triumph over arrogance and lies. And as the roar of applause shook the chamber, one question carried across every television screen, every phone, every heart beating faster than usual. What is the sound of truth applauded by a nation? The applause still rattled the walls when Habba pushed back her chair. Her face was drained, the smirk long gone, her steps unsteady as she gathered her papers with trembling hands. Cameras followed her every move, once the star of the spectacle, now reduced to a figure of disgrace retreating under the weight of her own unraveling. Jordan tried to shield her, rising quickly to walk at her side, but even his presence could not disguise the humiliation. The image was indelible, the iron lawyer reduced to a husk, leaving the chamber not in victory, but in shame. Outside, reporters swarmed the corridors, their voices overlapping in a storm of questions. "Miss Habba, do you deny the fraudulent filings? Do you still represent the former president?" She kept her eyes down, lips pressed shut, her silence speaking louder than any excuse. The footage shared instantly, broadcast across every major network, paired with headlines that struck like epitaphs. "End of an era, from iron to shattered. Habba falls in Capitol meltdown." Commentators, who once hailed her fearlessness, now dissected her downfall in real time, calling it one of the swiftest implosions of a legal career in American memory. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett emerged not just unscathed, but exalted. News anchors dubbed her the people's fighter. Editorials praised her restraint, her precision, her refusal to descend into the ugliness hurled at her. The New York Times headline read, "Crockett turns humiliation into history." Minority communities erupted with pride, their voices amplified on social media. "She spoke for us, she carried our weight." Her image calm, unbroken, binder in hand was plastered on protest banners, memes, and magazine covers within hours. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate her had instead cemented her as a symbol of courage and conviction. The chamber itself felt different as it emptied, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock of what they had witnessed. Lawmakers spoke in hushed tones, aware they had been present for a turning point. This was no longer just about Habba, it was about what Crockett represented, a generation no longer waiting for permission to speak, but seizing the stage with unflinching truth. And as the nation replayed the footage again and again, as the headlines blared and the chants outside grew louder, one question rose above the wreckage of pride and the birth of something new. Is this the end of one career or the beginning of a revolution? The morning after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett woke to a world transformed. Every network carried her face on its front page, every chyron ran her words in bold. Age does not define wisdom, but corruption always defines downfall. CNN called her the people's fighter. MSNBC ran a montage of her calm composure against Habba's frantic collapse, dubbing it the moment dignity defeated arrogance. Even skeptical outlets admitted the obvious: Crockett had not just survived the ambush, she had rewritten the script. Interview requests poured in from every major network, her phone buzzing relentlessly. By nightfall, she wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a national figure. Her first primetime interview aired live, the cameras tightening on her face as the anchor asked how she managed to remain silent under such ridicule. Crockett's voice was steady, her words deliberate. I stayed silent because I knew the truth was louder than their insults. I didn't speak for myself, I spoke for the millions who don't get a microphone, who don't get a seat at this table. Across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens. The image of her holding the crimson binder flashed again, spliced with footage of protests erupting outside the Capitol. Online, clips of her interview reached millions within hours, the comment sections flooded with praise. She's the voice we've been waiting for. Finally, someone who doesn't just fight back, but fights smart. In minority communities, the reaction was visceral. In Chicago, murals of her silhouette began appearing overnight, painted with the words "Truth is power." In Atlanta, churches played clips of her speech during Sunday service, congregations rising to their feet in applause. In Los Angeles, a candlelight vigil turned into a march, the crowd chanting her name as if she were more than a politician, she was a symbol. Elderly women wiped tears as they spoke to reporters. For once, I feel seen. Young activists held up their phones, replaying the moment she struck down Habba with a single line, declaring, "That's how you dismantle power." Her story became more than headlines, it became a mirror reflecting a nation's hunger for justice. Commentators began debating whether this was a flash in the pan or the start of something larger. Was Crockett just the heroine of one viral moment, or was she the embodiment of a movement tired of being ignored? Even political rivals whisper uneasily, if one underdog could command the spotlight with such precision, what else could she achieve with time? The arc of her rise was undeniable, but it carried weight. With every headline, every cheer, every chant in the streets, expectation mounted like a tidal wave. Crockett could feel it pressing against her shoulders, heavier than before, yet electrifying in its power. And as America replayed her triumph again and again, one question lingered over the applause, over the headlines, over the chants lighting up the night sky. Can one moment define a movement? In Washington, the fallout from Jasmine Crockett's triumph rippled like an earthquake through the halls of power. Democrats, once cautious and fractured, suddenly found their voices sharpened. They quoted her line in speeches, plastered her image across fundraising emails, and whispered openly that she had delivered a blueprint for how to face the Trump machine. Not with no's, but with precision. Committee members, who had been hesitant, now pressed forward with renewed aggression, emboldened by the sight of one of their own dismantling Trump's most visible defender on live television. The party that had been stumbling now walked taller, their confidence swelling with every headline replaying Habba's collapse. On the other side, panic spread like wildfire. Republicans huddled behind closed doors, their anger loud but their strategy fractured. Some demanded doubling down, urging Habba to fight back harder, to paint herself as a victim of a political hit job. Others muttered that she had become a liability, her implosion too public, too undeniable to spin away. The tension crackled within their ranks, the once unified front showing fractures that grew wider by the hour. Allies who had laughed during her attacks on Crockett now void reporters, their silence as telling as her downfall. Meanwhile, The Trump campaign scrambled to contain the blaze. Advisors rushed to craft statements dismissing the revelations as politically motivated smears, but even inside Mar-a-Lago, sources whispered of fury. Trump himself reportedly slammed the table, demanding answers on how his trusted attorney had walked into a hearing unprepared and left in disgrace. The campaign feared what came next, not just the headlines, but the investigation sure to follow once prosecutors smelled blood. What had begun as a performance designed to humiliate Crockett had mutated into a liability threatening to drag down the entire operation. In the corridors of power, the whispers grew louder. If Habba could fall, who was next? The answer was unclear, but the dread was unmistakable. A single crack had opened in the fortress of arrogance, and the sound of it reverberated across Washington. And as both parties recalibrated, one question lingered, ominous and unshakable. What happens when one crack threatens the whole wall? That night, long after the cameras had shut off and the chants outside the Capitol had faded into the night air, Jasmine Crockett sat in her office with the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The binder was still on the desk, its crimson cover now symbol of both victory and responsibility. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez slipped quietly into the room, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one in front of Crockett and studied her friend's face. "You changed everything today," AOC said softly, but her tone carried both admiration and warning. Crockett let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Did I?" Her voice trembled with exhaustion, but also with something deeper fear of what came next. She thought of the millions who had cheered her name, the murals already going up in her district, the mothers and daughters who now looked to her as proof that silence could be broken. She had spoken for them, but now their hopes weighed on her like chains. "What if I can't carry it all?" she whispered. AOC leaned forward, eyes blazing. "You don't carry it alone. Every time you speak, every time you fight, you give them permission to fight too. That's the burden of leadership. It's heavy, but it's also the only way change ever comes." Tears welled in Crockett's eyes, not of weakness, but of the release that comes when a fighter admits the cost of the battle. She remembered the faces from her district, the grandmother who told her not to let their voices be stolen, the beau who asked if anyone would ever fight for him. Tonight, their faith felt heavier than victory. She looked at AOC and asked, "What if I failed them?" The answer came without hesitation. "Then you rise again." Because leaders aren't defined by never falling, they're defined by refusing to stay down. For a moment, the 2 women sat in silence, not the silence of fear this time, but of solidarity. The world outside was chaotic, unforgiving, but in that room, 2 fighters shared the unspoken truth. Every triumph comes with scars, every victory with sacrifice. Crockett nodded, her resolve settling once more. The burden was real, the cost undeniable, but so was the pride of knowing she had carried her people's voice into the heart of power and made it thunder. And as she closed her eyes, one question lingered, as sharp and haunting as the gavel's echo. Can courage be carried without cost, or is the cost itself the proof of courage? By the end of the week, the ripple had become a wave. Grassroots rallies ignited in cities from Atlanta to Los Angeles, crowds spilling into the streets with homemade banners and megaphones. In Chicago, marchers carried signs painted in bold black letters, "Crockett equals courage." In Houston, murals of her silhouette holding the crimson binder appeared overnight on the sides of buildings, glowing beneath streetlights like declarations of defiance. In New York, a crowd of thousands gathered in Union Square, chanting her name in unison, their voices ricocheting off skyscrapers as though demanding the city itself bear witness. It wasn't just political theater, it was personal. For years, minority communities had been dismissed, drowned out by the machinery of power, but now their voices roared with clarity. Mothers held up pictures of children lost to injustice, declaring, "She fought for us." College students wrapped themselves in banners of her words, their chants shaking campuses. Age does not define wisdom, but corruption always defines downfall. The words spread like scripture, carried on cardboard signs, spray-painted on walls, shouted through bullhorns. Hope was no longer fragile, it was contagious. Media outlets struggled to keep pace with the wildfire of support. MSNBC declared, "Crockett has become the people's standard-bearer." CNN reported turnout numbers in the tens of thousands, while even Fox was forced to acknowledge the undeniable crowds filling the streets, though they labeled them manufactured outrage. But the images spoke for themselves. seas of faces, fists raised, voices united. The protests were not orchestrated by campaigns or committees, they erupted from the ground up, fueled by the raw electricity of a nation that had finally seen someone refuse to be silenced. For Crockett, it was both humbling and terrifying. She watched the coverage in quiet awe, knowing that the movement was no longer hers alone. Her name had become a banner, her moment a spark, her courage the match that lit something far larger than herself. And as chants thundered from coast to coast, one question rose above the nose, sharp and undeniable, echoing across streets, screens, and hearts alike. What happens when hope becomes contagious? Habba vanished almost as quickly as the headlines consumed her. The woman once branded as Trump's iron lawyer now retreated into the shadows, her public calendar wiped clean, her usual flurry of television appearances abruptly cancelled. Reporters camped outside her New Jersey home, waiting for a statement, but the blinds stayed drawn, the driveway empty. Neighbors whispered of late-night lights flickering in her office window, but no one saw her step outside. For someone who had lived in the glare of cameras, her absence was louder than any press conference. Inside that silence, Habba faced the collapse of everything she had built. Law firms cut ties, judges reviewed her cases with suspicion, clients abandoned her name like a stain they could no longer afford to wear. The Wall Street Journal ran a brutal editorial, credibility lost. MSNBC replayed the clip of her unraveling on a loop, dubbing it the end of an era. Even Fox, once her safe harbor, quietly shifted its focus elsewhere, leaving her stranded. The legal world she once dominated now regarded her with contempt. Whispers spreading in courtrooms, "She's finished." At night, she sat in her study surrounded by shelves of law books that now felt like mocking relics. The crimson binder haunted her mind, each page a reminder of the truth she could not spin away. She replayed the hearing in her head, over and over, the laughter that turned against her, Crockett's silence that became a weapon, the fatal line that shattered her facade. Pride had once been her armor, arrogance her sword, but stripped of them she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of disgrace. Habba had always believed she could outshine, outlast anyone, but now she understood the truth she had spent her career denying. When the applause fades, when the cameras turn away, all that remains is the record of what you've done, and hers was poisoned beyond repair. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, the silence pressing in on every side, and the question rose like a verdict she could not escape. What's left when the applause dies? The cameras cut back in, but this time it was not to a courtroom clash or a viral confrontation. It was Jasmine Crockett standing alone at a podium, the flag of the United States behind her, the weight of a nation pressing on her shoulders. The silence before she spoke was heavy, charged, as if every American watching at home understood they were about to hear not just a statement, but a challenge. Her voice, steady and resonant, carried through the lens with the authority of someone who had earned every syllable. This moment is not about me. It is not about one hearing, one binder, or even one opponent. It is about who we are as a people, and who we are willing to become. She spoke of unity, not as a distant dream, but as a demand. We cannot let arrogance, lies, or corruption divide us into enemies. Justice is not partisan. Truth does not belong to Democrats or Republicans, it belongs to the people. And the people are watching. Her words reached through the screen, pulling millions closer. She invoked accountability, reminding Americans that silence in the face of DC was not neutrality, but complicity. She spoke of mothers who buried their sons, workers who labored without dignity, communities on ignore until they roared too loud to be silenced. Her voice rose with emotion, the kind that pulled at the gut. I stood my ground not for applause, but because silence in that chamber would have been betrayal. I did it because every one of you, every citizen who has ever been told you don't matter, deserves to know that your truth can still shake the foundations of power. The room behind her seemed to fade away as her words filled living rooms, offices, classrooms across America. On social media, hearts and fists filled comment sections, her sentences clipped into sound bites already racing across the digital bloodstream. Then came the crescendo, her eyes burning with conviction. But I cannot do this alone. Courage cannot live in one person, it must live in millions. In the fight for justice, silence is complicity, so which side will you choose? She let the words hang, sharp as steel, soft as prayer. The nation sat in stillness, shaken and stirred, every viewer forced to confront their own reflection. And as the screen faded to black, a final question scrolled across in bold white letters, daring Americans to answer with action rather than apathy. Do you believe America can still rise from truth? The heart of this story teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act with integrity when fear and doubt scream the loudest. Jasmine Crockett proved that a single voice, steady and unshaken, can dismantle arrogance and ignite hope for millions. In life, we all face moments where silence feels safer, but silence feeds injustice, while truth, even spoken softly, has the power to shake walls and move nations. The question for each of us is simple yet profound. When that moment arrives for you, will you remain silent or will you rise and speak with courage? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.